What would you do if you woke up one morning to find your home wasn't really yours anymore? Not because you sold it, not because you missed a payment, but because a group of strangers had decided they owned it more than you did. It started like any other Saturday morning. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting warm slants of gold across the freshly mopped kitchen floor. The smell of coffee filled the air as I sat at the table, watching Sophie stack colorful blocks into a wobbly tower while Olivia scrolled through her phone. Emily hummed softly as she poured herself a cup, and for a moment, life felt perfectly normal. Then I saw it. A piece of bright yellow paper, fluttering on the front door like a warning flag. It hadn't been there an hour ago. I set my mug down and walked to the door, my bare feet cool against the hardwood floor. When I opened it, the crisp morning air carried the scent of freshly cut grass, my freshly cut grass. I stepped onto the porch, my stomach twisting as I pulled the paper free and unfolded it. Violation notice. The words screamed at me in bold, capitalized letters. Beneath them was a list of infractions, each more ridiculous than the last. Grass length exceeding community standards. Mailbox improperly placed. Unauthorized modifications to exterior color. I glanced around, my eyes scanning the yard. The lawn was trimmed. The flower beds were neat. The mailbox, a standard black metal post, stood exactly where it had since the day we moved in. A mistake, I thought. Some kind of mix-up. We had bought this house 2 years ago, with no mention of an HOA. There had been no contracts, no neighborhood meetings, no fees. If there was an HOA, why hadn't we heard of it before? I pulled out my phone and dialed Lisa Mitchell, our real estate agent. She picked up after a few rings, her voice cheerful but cautious. "Hey, Daniel. How's the house treating you?" "Lisa, do you remember anything about an HOA when we closed on this place?" A pause. Then a slow, uncertain reply. "That's strange. No, I don't. I would have flagged that for you. What's going on?" I read her the notice. Another pause. A longer one. "Daniel, listen, this doesn't make sense. As far as I knew, there wasn't an active HOA when you bought the property." Before I could respond, a shadow moved across the sidewalk. I turned my head just in time to see a sleek black SUV creeping down the street. Its tinted windows were rolled up, but I could feel the weight of unseen eyes studying my house, my lawn, my mailbox. It slowed as it passed, a deliberate hesitation, before rolling forward and disappearing around the bend. My grip tightened around the paper. Something wasn't right. Emily sensed something was wrong the moment I walked back inside. I must have looked tense because she set her coffee down and gave me that concerned tilt of her head. "What is it?" she asked. I handed her the notice without a word. She read through it, her brows knitting together. "This has to be a mistake," she murmured. "We don't have an HOA." "That's what I thought," I said. "But someone thinks we do." Before we could discuss it further, another movement outside caught my attention. I turned toward the window, and there it was again, that same black SUV rolling past, slow, deliberate. It crawled along the curb like a predator sizing up its prey. Emily followed my gaze. "That's the second time today," she whispered. I didn't like it. Something about the way that car moved, the way it hesitated in front of our house, it wasn't random. Someone was watching us. By the next morning, the harassment had escalated. A second violation notice arrived, this one demanding $500 for unapproved fence height and non-compliant paint color. My fence, which I'd measured myself when I built it last summer, stood exactly 6 feet high, well within standard residential limits. The paint color? The same neutral white every other house had. That wasn't the worst part. As I stepped onto my porch, I saw my neighbor, Greg Harper, standing in his yard, clipboard in hand. He looked away quickly when I caught his eye, shuffling awkwardly toward his front door. I walked straight to him. "Greg," I called, keeping my tone even. He hesitated before turning. "Morning, Daniel. What's going on?" I asked, nodding toward the clipboard. "Are you documenting something?" His grip tightened around the edges of the board. "Just helping the community," he muttered. Something in his voice, guilt, maybe even fear, made my stomach sink. "Helping who?" I pressed. Greg sighed, lowering his voice. "Look, Daniel, they asked me to keep track of violations. I didn't have a choice." "They?" "The HOA." He swallowed hard. "Vicky." Anger boiled in my chest. "So you're spying for them?" Greg's eyes darted toward his house, as if afraid someone might be listening. "She promised me I wouldn't get fined if I helped," he admitted. "Said if I didn't, I'd be next." I took a step back, my fists clenching. Vicky Reynolds wasn't just running an HOA, she was running a damn racket. That afternoon, things got worse. My Amazon packages never arrived. I checked my tracking number, delivered. But there was nothing on my porch. When I called FedEx, the driver told me he'd been instructed not to deliver to my address due to community access restrictions. The pizza place we'd ordered from for years suddenly refused to bring us food. "I'm sorry," the manager said. "We can't find your house in our system." Emily tried calling customer service, but every explanation was the same. Our home had been removed from multiple databases. I started keeping a journal of every incident, taking pictures, saving emails. Vicky was isolating us, cutting us off from services, turning the entire neighborhood against us. The final straw came 3 nights later. A dark van appeared at the end of the street, parked just outside the reach of our driveway cameras. It just sat there. No markings, no movement. At first, I thought I was imagining things. But then Olivia came downstairs, rubbing her arms. "Dad," she whispered. "There's someone watching the house." I checked the street again. The van was still there. Engine running, headlights off. Emily stood behind me, her voice barely audible. "Daniel, I don't feel safe." Neither did I. The next morning, I drove straight to the county recorder's office to settle this HOA nonsense once and for all. I demanded to see the records for Oakwood Estates. But when the clerk pulled up the files, my blood ran cold. The documents had changed. Our house was now listed under the jurisdiction of Oakwood Estates HOA, with a signature next to my name. My signature. I never signed anything. I pushed the papers toward the clerk. "This is fake. This wasn't here before." She hesitated, glancing toward the back offices, as if afraid someone might overhear. Then she leaned in and whispered. "They rewrote the history of your home." I drove home with my mind spinning. If they had the power to forge legal documents and manipulate official property records, what else could they do? The answer came sooner than I expected. The next morning, I arrived at work only to be met with a strange silence. People who usually greeted me barely looked up from their desks. HR called me in before I even reached my office. My supervisor, Mark, sat stiffly behind his desk, his expression tight. "Daniel," he said, his tone unnervingly formal. "We need to talk." A folder sat in front of him. My name was on it. My stomach dropped. "We received a complaint," he continued. "Multiple, actually." He pushed the folder toward me. Inside were printed emails, their sender hidden, but the subject lines were damning. Disruptive behavior in the community. Repeated refusal to comply with homeowners' regulations. Ongoing disputes creating a hostile neighborhood environment. I stared at the papers. This is a lie. Mark exhaled sharply. Look, I don't know what's going on between you and your HOA, but this kind of attention is bad for the company. Your name is starting to show up in online discussions. Our leadership doesn't want to be associated with that kind of controversy. You're firing me? I asked, my voice tight. He hesitated. Officially, we're restructuring. Your position is being eliminated. I gritted my teeth. Vicky did this. She had found a way to reach into my career and pull the rug out from under me. I drove home, my grip white-knuckled on the wheel, my heart hammering in my chest. Emily was in the kitchen when I walked in, her face pale. I just got off the phone with Olivia's school, she whispered. She's being expelled. What? I almost dropped my keys. Emily's hands trembled as she held up an email from the school board. Repeated disruptive behavior. Defamation of the neighborhood association. Encouraging harassment of other students. I sank into a chair, my head in my hands. This isn't happening. She told people the truth, Daniel, Emily said, her voice shaking. She just told them what's happening to us. A noise from the doorway made me look up. Olivia stood there, her eyes wet with frustrated tears. I didn't do anything wrong, she said. I know, I said, standing up and pulling her into a hug. I know. But Vicky had made sure that didn't matter. By the end of the week, no one in town would speak to us. Greg Harper, who once mowed his lawn with a wave and a friendly nod, wouldn't even glance in my direction. Other neighbors turned away as we passed. Parents who once chatted with Emily at the school pickup line now gathered in tight groups, whispering. The grocery store refused my membership card, claiming my name wasn't in the system. The pharmacy delayed refilling our prescriptions, citing a processing error. And then came the final insult. A "for sale" sign appeared on our front lawn. I stood in the driveway, staring at it, rage buzzing in my veins. I yanked it out of the ground, stormed into the house, and slammed the sign onto the kitchen table. Daniel, where did that come from? Emily asked, her voice tight with fear. They put it there. Who? I didn't have to say it. We both knew. I pulled out my laptop and searched my address on real estate listings. And there it was. Upcoming property listing, prime residential space in Oakwood Estates. Anticipated availability, 30 to 60 days. Contact Vicky Reynolds, licensed broker. They were preparing to sell my house before I even left it. I clenched my fists, my pulse roaring in my ears. Emily whispered, Daniel, what do we do? I looked at her. At Olivia, standing behind her, still shaking from being expelled. At Sophie, playing with her toys in the other room, blissfully unaware of how our lives were being ripped apart. I took a slow breath. We fight. I spent the rest of the night at the dining table, surrounded by a mess of documents, printed emails, screenshots, and property records. The cold glow of my laptop screen reflected off my coffee mug, long since emptied. Emily sat beside me, silently flipping through pages, her brows furrowed. Across the room, Olivia hovered near the doorway, hesitant but determined. I found something, she said, walking over with her phone in hand. Look. She turned the screen toward me, and I scanned the page. It was a community forum post from a woman in another neighborhood, nearly identical to ours. She described being harassed by her HOA, receiving fake violation notices, and eventually being forced to sell. The comments were full of similar stories. Vicky's done this before, Olivia murmured. I clicked through different posts, each one confirming what I already suspected. This wasn't just about us. This was a pattern. A strategy. By morning, I had a new plan. I started with the paper trail. I dug through county land records, HOA filings, and financial disclosures. And that's when I saw it. Vicky wasn't just the HOA president, she was a real estate broker. She had been involved in multiple property transfers across several neighborhoods, always in the same pattern: harass homeowners with bogus violations, push them into financial distress, then scoop up the property for cheap and flip it for massive profit. The next piece of evidence arrived unexpectedly. An elderly neighbor, Eleanor "Ellie" Jennings, knocked on my door that afternoon, a nervous look in her eyes. When I opened it, she pressed a manila folder into my hands. "You didn't get this from me," she whispered, glancing around before shuffling away. Inside were internal HOA financial records. They showed where the money was going, not to neighborhood maintenance, but directly into Vicky's brokerage accounts. Emily stood beside me, reading over my shoulder. "She's embezzling. This isn't just HOA corruption," I muttered. "This is fraud." By the end of the night, I had compiled a digital dossier. It contained forged HOA agreements, including the fake signature they used for our house. Financial records showing HOA fines funneling into Vicky's personal accounts. Multiple homeowners' testimonies describing the exact same harassment pattern. A map showing Vicky's connection to at least 5 previous neighborhoods where she had pulled the same scam. It wasn't just a local dispute anymore. This was a criminal enterprise. Now, I just had to expose it. I uploaded everything into a private blog, carefully worded to avoid legal retaliation. I posted screenshots of documents, time-stamped citations, and financial discrepancies. Olivia helped me spread the word online, sharing the blog in community groups, neighborhood forums, and local discussion threads. It didn't take long for people to notice. By the next day, comments started flooding in. Other homeowners, from multiple states, recognized Vicky's name. Some shared their own horror stories. Others sent in more evidence. And then, a journalist reached out. Jessica "Jess" Parker, an investigative reporter from the local news station, called me that evening. "I read your blog," she said. "If what you're saying is true, this isn't just a story, this is a scandal." She wanted to meet. The next morning, Jess sat in my kitchen, her notepad filled with questions. She listened as I laid out everything: the false fines, the property scams, the harassment tactics. Then I handed her Ellie's folder. Her eyes widened as she flipped through the documents. "This is huge," she muttered. "This isn't just HOA abuse, this is organized fraud." She took down names, dates, and figures. "I need to verify some things, but if this checks out, I'll take it to my editor. This could blow up fast." That night, as Emily and I sat at the table, exhaustion creeping into our bones, my phone buzzed. An unknown number. I hesitated before answering. A mechanical voice, distorted and cold, whispered through the receiver. "Stop digging." Then the line went dead. I clenched my jaw, staring at the screen. I wasn't stopping. I was just getting started. The community center was packed. Every chair was filled, and a small crowd stood near the back, murmuring among themselves. At the front of the room, Vicky Reynolds sat stiffly in a pressed blazer, flanked by the HOA board members, her hands folded neatly over a stack of papers. She looked calm, confident. But I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she gripped her pen just a little too tightly. I had spent weeks preparing for this moment. Every late night, every piece of evidence, every homeowner's testimony, it all led here. The microphone crackled as I stood before the board. "We're here to discuss the ongoing issues with 1742 Oakwood Lane," Vicky announced, her voice laced with artificial politeness. "Mr. Carter has failed to comply with multiple community regulations and has refused to pay his outstanding fines." I set my folder on the table, flipping it open with deliberate ease. "I'm not a registered HOA member," I said, my voice steady. "And neither are half the people you've extorted." The room went silent. A few heads turned toward each other, murmuring. I pulled out the financial records Ellie had given me and held them up. These fines aren't for community maintenance, are they, Vicky? They're funneled straight into your brokerage accounts. A murmur of shock rippled through the audience. Vicky's face twitched. That's an outrageous accusation. I slid the forged HOA agreements onto the table. These signatures? Fake. You altered county records to make it look like we agreed to be part of your HOA when we never did. The journalist, Jess Parker, was in the back of the room, taking notes. The local news station had already picked up the story. A balding HOA member adjusted his tie nervously. Another one wiped his forehead. The tension in the room was shifting. Then, the final blow. The county has already confirmed that the HOA was never properly ratified, I continued, turning toward the audience. Which means none of the fines, none of the foreclosures, none of the liens, are legal. The room erupted. Neighbors, some of whom had ignored me for weeks, turned to each other in disbelief. Someone shouted, "You mean we've been paying for nothing?" A commotion broke out among the board members. Vicky's mask of confidence cracked. For the first time, I saw panic in her eyes. A voice from the back called out, "Check the news." People pulled out their phones. And there it was. A breaking story, local HOA president under investigation for fraud. Vicky grabbed her papers and stood. "This meeting is over," she snapped. "Sit down, Ms. Reynolds," a new voice commanded. A city council official stepped forward, accompanied by 2 officers. One of them held a warrant. "You're under investigation for fraud, illegal property transfers, and financial misconduct," the officer said. The room fell dead silent as Vicky's face drained of color. "You can't," she sputtered, but it was too late. As they led her away, the neighbors who had once feared her stood and cheered. The HOA board scrambled, trying to distance themselves, but they were next in line for scrutiny. By the end of the month, the HOA was dissolved. Homeowners who had been bullied into paying fines filed lawsuits. The county passed new restrictions on HOA powers, preventing scams like this from happening again. And me? I walked outside one evening, standing on my own porch, the same porch where I had first seen that yellow violation notice. But this time, there were no letters, no threats. Just my home. My family. The nightmare was over. But as I glanced down the street, I noticed something. Greg Harper's house, the man who had spied on me for the HOA, was empty. "For sale" sign in the yard. Vicky had thrown him under the bus, too. I smirked. Guess loyalty didn't mean much in a scam. I turned back inside, locking the door behind me. "So, what would you have done? Would you have fought back or just paid the fines and walked away? Have you ever felt powerless against an HOA, or a Karen in disguise? Share your experiences below, let's see who had it worse.